This video goes through HMH, Module 8, Lesson 2. How can you write equivalent percents, fractions, and decimals? First, I'm going to go through the notes for Lesson 2 in Module 8 in case you were unable to access HMH notes. So first question, using models can help show how fractions, decimals, and percents are related. So in the center you see 78 hundredths is the same as the fraction 78 over 100, or 78 out of 100, which is 78%. We can see that on the grid if we color in, let's see, 78 cubes on our 100 grid. There is our 78 hundredths, 78%, 78 out of 100. Other examples, 0 and 54 hundredths. You can see that the fraction is 54 over 100 and the percent is 54%. 68 hundredths, 68 over 100, or 68%. And 6 tenths, that means 6 out of 100 and 6%. Fill in the model, 1 and 42 hundredths. So when we look at 1 and 42 hundredths, that means we have one whole colored in, 100 out of 100, and then we have 42 out of 100. So on my grid, I'm going to color in 42 hundredths to show, here's my one whole, and then my 42 hundredths. So I end up with 142 hundredths, or one whole, and that 42 hundredths. We have 100%, that's this whole grid is 100% filled, plus this one is 42% filled, which means we have 142%. Over here, 1 and 73 hundredths means we have 1 and 73 out of 100. This is 100% plus 73%, which is a total of 170%. Fill in the model. The model shows 100% plus, well, let's fill it in. We have 125%, so it would show one whole. This is my 100% filled. And then I have to have 25 out of 100 filled on my second 100 grid to show that 25%. So 100 plus 25% equals 125%, and the decimal is 1 and 25 hundredths. So here's my one whole, my 25 hundredths. I can also think about that as percent, 100% here, 25% here, and I'm putting those two together. 125%, again, it means we have 100 out of 100 in our first grid, 25 out of 100 in the second grid, so we have 125 hundredths total colored in, or one whole and 25 hundredths. We can simplify 25 hundredths by dividing out that greatest common factor. So this is the same as 1 and 1/4. We have one whole grid filled in and then 1/4 of another grid. All right, over here we have 1 and 4 hundredths. So that's 100 out of 100 plus 4 hundredths equals 1 and 4 hundredths. In percents, it's 100% plus 4%, so it's 104%. Lorenzo spends 35% of his budget on rent for his apartment. Write this percent as a fraction and a decimal. So when we write it as a fraction, we're thinking about, we would be coloring in 35 out of 100. We can simplify this fraction by dividing out that 5, the greatest common factor, which gives us 7/20. And then to write this percent as a decimal, we're going to write the equivalent of 35 hundredths, which looks like this as a decimal. So again, our fraction simplified is 7/20, and our decimal is 35 hundredths. 96 out of 200 animals treated by a veterinarian are horses. Write 96 out of 200 as a decimal and a percent. So first thing we're going to do is simplify by dividing out the greatest common factor. So in this case, we're going to get in per 100. So we're going to divide by 2. So 200 divided by 2 got us to 100. And then when we take 96 divided by 2, we end up with 48. So we have 48 hundredths. And that equals the decimal 48 hundredths. 48 out of 100 means 48%. So 48% were horses. All right, let's simplify over here. 64 out of 200. Again, we're going to use that strategy. We're going to divide by 2 to get per 100. Divide by 2. 64 divided by 2 equals 32 hundredths. So now that we're in per 100, we can write that as a percent, 32. Use your calculator to change 1/8 as to a decimal. So 1/8 of the animals treated by a veterinarian are dogs. Write 1/8 as a decimal and a percent. When you use your calculator and do 1 divided by 8, you end up with the decimal 0 and 125 thousandths. You can see here's my calculator display down here. Write the decimal as a percent. To go from a decimal to a percent, we want to move that decimal point 2 to the right. So this turns out to be 12.5%, 12.5%. Use your calculator to change 7/8 to a decimal. So you can see here's my decimal change. 7 divided by 8, 875 thousandths, which means it is 87.5 or 87.5. Lesson 8.2 summary. Percent means per hundred, so any percent can be written as a fraction with a denominator of 100 and then can be written in simplest form. Any fraction can be written as a decimal by dividing the numerator by the denominator. So we see that here. To get 3/5 into a decimal, we can do 3 divided by 5. All right, write an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100. So we have 19 25ths, and we want to get it per 100. So we're going to use some mental math. 25 times 4 will get us to 100. And so we need to do 19 times 4 to figure out our per 100. 19 times 4 equals 76. So if we colored that in on the grid, we'd be coloring in 76 cubes. So 76 per 100. This equals 76%. It also equals the decimal 76 hundredths. 15 out of 50 students. Again, we're going to use some mental math to change this to per 100. 50 times 2 gets me to 100, so I'm going to do 15 times 2. That means it's 30 out of 100. If I want to show that on my grid, I would color in 30 hundredths. I can now write this as a percent, 30%, and as an equivalent decimal, either 3/10, or if I want it to say 30 hundredths, I can put that 0 on. Write an equivalent decimal and fraction, 20% of the books. So 20% means 20 out of 100. So here is my fraction. I'm going to simplify by dividing out the greatest common factor, which is 20. 20 divided by 20 is 1. 100 divided by 20 is 5. So there's my simplified fraction. And then my decimal is 20 hundredths. I could also write this as 2/10. Write an equivalent decimal and percent. 144 out of 200 of the tickets. So we're going to change this to a per 100 so that we can easily write a decimal and a percent. So to get from 200 to 100, I'm going to divide by 2. So I'm also going to divide 144 by 2. When I do that, I end up with 72 hundredths. I can change that to my decimal, 72 hundredths, and my percent, 72%. 65% of the students write an equivalent decimal in a fraction. So we can think about in our little grid, we would have 60 and 5 more cubes. Here's how it looks on my grid. 65%, 65 per 100. So 65 hundredths. Here's my decimal. And 65 hundredths, this can be simplified by dividing out a common factor. So if I take and divide by 5, I end up with 13/20 as my simplified fraction. Write an equivalent decimal and percent. 225 hundredths of last year's cost. So if I'm going to do this, this is, if I imagine on my grid, it's already out of 100, so here's my 100, 200, and then I have to have 25, so 20 and 5 more. When I look at this as a decimal, I have 1 plus 25 hundredths, so that means 2 and 25 hundredths. If I want to look at this as a percent, I have 100% plus 100% plus 25% equals 225%. Chloe answered 42 of the 50 questions correctly. So she has 42 out of 50. I'm going to put this per 100 so that I can easily write an equivalent decimal and fraction. So I can think 50 times 2 gets me to 100, so 42 times 2. 42 times 2 is 84. So my equivalent decimal is 84 hundredths. And then I'm going to write just that percent, 84%. So she got a B on that assignment. Write the ratio 41 to 100 as a percent. So 41 to 100 just means we'd have 41 out of 100. So that would be 41%. Write 23 hundredths as a percent. So that would be, if we're looking at our grid, here's our 23 hundredths, which means 23%.